honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's an honour to rise today to speak to Bill C-58, the long-awaited amendments to the Access to Information and Privacy Act. As we've heard from many Liberal members, this is the first time the Act has been substantially amended since its initial debut. It's been said by many of us in the environmental law community that Canada doesn't so much have freedom of information legislation, we have freedom from information legislation. And we had hoped for far more openness, given the promise that was in the Liberal platform, and I'll just repeat it as a way of context setting for my presentation, that, quote, we will ensure that access to information applies to the Prime Minister's and Ministers' offices as well as administrative institutions that support Parliament and the courts, unquote. To give Liberals their due, let me cover some of the things that I think represent improvements in openness under the new government, and then focus more substantively on the failures and gaps in this legislation. We do have on the Treasury Board website the heralding of access to information open by default. I think that's a stretch, but it certainly is a positive step, and I want to emphasize that. This Prime Minister is the first that I know of in our history to have made the mandate letters to ministers public letters. That had an impact already on other governments. When Premier John Horgan became Premier in my home province of British Columbia recently and formed his cabinet, the mandate letters became public. I think that's the first time that's happened at a provincial level, but once it happens federally and once a Prime Minister does it, people say, well, where are the mandate letters? I'm pleased to see that in this legislation, mandate letters of a Prime Minister to members of his or her cabinet will, going forward, be legislated requirements for openness. That's a very good thing. I think it's a good thing to know that briefing packages of ministers will be proactively revealed, that there will be question period binders made public, hospitality expenses, contracts over $10,000, and so on. Those will be proactively disclosed, including from ministers' offices, expenses including from senators, a lot more transparency around things that I'm going to describe as routine. Expenses that are predictable, contracts that are large, briefing documents that are predictable. It's also important to note that it will apply to other agencies of and institutions within the Government of Canada. Unfortunately, this is not what was promised. What was promised was that access to information legislation would apply to a Prime Minister's office, to a ministerial office, so that, for instance, when an issue arises, a member of the public or the media can say, how did that happen? I'd like to do an access request. And that will not be permitted under this legislation. We will not see the opportunity that we thought was going to transpire in this legislation. We certainly had lots of knowledgeable members of what might call the architecture of privacy and information in this country recommend it. For instance, Information Commissioner Suzanne Legault had recommended that it would be up to access to information officials and officers to determine whether emails and memos in and out of a PMO or a minister's office were political or parliamentary in nature, in which case they would be recommended to remain confidential, or would pertain to running a department, in which case they would be accessible through access to information. That recommendation has not made it into this legislation, C-58. Perhaps the Liberals are open to seeing amendments to C-58 that would allow the legislation to meet the earlier promise. In some ways, and in this I'm going to quote from an article by Stephen Maher at iPolitics, because he's certainly one of, I think, Canada's leading investigative journalists, certainly has a lot of experience with access to information, used it very effectively to investigate the robocall scandal, among other things. And what he wrote was, quote, the proactive disclosure of some ministerial documents may be a step backward, because the decisions about what to release and what to redact will not be reviewable by the Information Commissioner. So, in a sense, what looks like a step forward is actually a step backward. Was it an unintentional step backward? Well, we'll have to find out at committee how open the Liberals are to amendments on this bill. One of the things that I found very concerning is found at section 6.1, which is that the head of a government institution can, on his or her own initiative, decide to ignore an access to information request If among many reasons that are reasonable, such as the request does not meet the requirements set out in the Act, okay, that's reasonable. Or the person has already been given access to the record and may access the record by other means, and so on. Or that is for a large number of records necessitates such a large search that would unreasonably interfere with the operations of government. But this one is outrageous. Sub D to 6.1 sub 1. The head of a government institution may, on his or her own initiative and not reviewably, refuse to accept an access to information request if, quote, the request is vexatious. Now, that's a subjective term, and if an institution decides to say that someone's interest in, for instance, toxic chemicals in their watershed is something that the department doesn't want to share with the public, all they have to do is say this is vexatious. Vexatious is far too subjective and far too restrictive to be allowed in government legislation. It certainly is a shock in legislation that was supposed to take us to the promise of open and accessible government. There are other areas where we're also looking at the those who are knowledgeable saying this legislation isn't as good, for instance, as what other provincial governments have already accepted in terms of openness. The government of British Columbia, for example, government of Alberta, their information commissioners have more robust powers than the federal information commissioner will now have even after this legislation is passed. That's a surprise, because I thought from the Liberal promises during the election campaign that this new access to information legislation would set a new high watermark to which other jurisdictions can aspire. But unfortunately, they've fallen short of existing powers that provincial governments already have for their information commissioners. I'm again going to quote someone who's expert in this area, Vincent Gogolek, who's the executive director of the British Columbia Freedom of Information and Privacy Association. And what he said is, this is what we have here in British Columbia, and responsible government hasn't collapsed here. So the government of British Columbia has been living with a far more robust freedom of information regime, and it's not extended now to our federal law and the access to information that we certainly did expect to come forward from this government. How much of this is reviewable by information commissioners? That's a very important point. We did not think that at any point the decisions about what was accessible would fall only, and there have been discussions, admittedly, in committee, in recommendations, that there needs to be some screen to deal with requests that might be seen as vexatious. But the screen wasn't supposed to be a subjective unilateral decision by the head of the agency in whose control the information resides. It needs to reside with the information commissioner or members of that agency as officials to decide, is this releasable or is it not? Is it vexatious or is it not? And that failure in this legislation is substantial, and I sincerely hope that when it gets to committee, we're going to have an openness to amendments, because if this legislation stays as it is, at that point there's no question it will be a broken promise, because as much as there have been steps towards greater openness compared to the previous administration, this legislation will fall far short of the Liberals' election promises and will also compare unfavorably to regimes already found in other provinces. So the model here is a weak model. We do find it in other provinces. We find it in Newfoundland and Labrador. We do not find it in British Columbia and Alberta. We're looking at exemptions throughout the Act that are far too broad. Certainly access to cabinet documents is not something we will see. And the question of who redacts and whether the redactions are acceptable, those will also fall to the agency itself and not, as I understand it, not be reviewable by the Information Commissioner. So I know, Madam Speaker, that there have been a lot of concerns from the opposition benches. I wanted to give balance in my presentation today because it occurred to me in the debate on C-58 that members of the Canadian public watching this debate might be baffled by the assertions by Liberals. This does apply to ministers' offices. It does apply to PMO. And those in the opposition benches saying the failure is it didn't. Proactive disclosure of some things like briefing documents, spending, contracts, and so on is a good thing to do. But here's the rub. It may actually be, as I mentioned earlier, a step backward by giving that control solely to the agency itself, not allowing it to be reviewable. In other words, increasing the discretion of those who control information to deny information. Thank you, Madam Speaker.